Hey everybody, what's going on? I hope you are well. I am so excited about today's talk. I want to title today's talk, Jesus Loves Skeptics, because many of you watching this have some sort of skepticism when it comes to Jesus, probably even beyond doubt, but just straight up disbelief. Like you struggle with the idea of the existence of God, or maybe you just don't really believe the validity of who Jesus said he was, whatever. You are a skeptic, and this message is for you. But then there's also many of you watching this who are followers of Jesus. You believe in Jesus, but sometimes you doubt. So it's not that you are an unbeliever, but it's that you sometimes doubt your own belief. And this message is also for you because there's two stories in the Bible from Jesus' life that I love. I think you're going to be fascinated by. I am captivated by these. Every time I read these stories, I'm just like, man, Jesus is incredible. And it's two stories about Jesus' interactions with two different people, two different guys who you could classify as skeptics in different ways in their own right. And the first one is about this guy Nathaniel. Nathaniel is a student, and his friend Philip has just met Jesus. And Philip is coming to Nathaniel saying, hey, you got to meet this guy, you got to meet this guy. And check out Nathaniel's response. This is from John 1 at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. It says, Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets have also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Check out what Nathanael says. He says, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. Come and see, said Philip. And when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, check out what Jesus says to him. He says, here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. How do you know me? Nathanael asks. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. And then Nathanael declares, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. Did you check out Nathanael's? Did you notice Nathanael's initial response to Philip telling him about Jesus? Like it's probably similar to many of you, if you're not a believer in Jesus, probably similar to the response that you would have to your overzealous Christian friend who's coming and telling you all about Jesus and wants to convince you about how he's real and all of that stuff. And you're probably thinking in that moment, like, that sounds like foolishness. That sounds like a fairy tale, and like, Nathaniel's a smart guy, and I'm sure you're a smart person as well. And so when you hear things like about a God who created the world, who's all powerful and he's all good, and he came to the world as a human being and he died and he rose again, you might be thinking like, that sounds like a fantasy novel, and I get it. You might be thinking like, we don't need to believe in that stuff anymore. We have reason, we have logic. And I get it. I get it. But one of the things that happens often to people who have intellectual problems with the story of Christianity is that one of the hazards to it is that it can make us just a little bit arrogant. And I think that's what's happened with Nathanael. If you notice Nathanael in his response to Philip, when Philip says, I've found the guy, I've found Jesus. And Nathanael's like, you can't believe everything that you hear, man. Like he says, what good can come from Nazareth? That's his first century way of saying, like, aren't we smarter than this, Philip? Aren't we better than this now? And I could go on and on about why I think the story of Christianity is true and why I think Jesus really is who he said he is. But here's a myth out there that I think we need to talk about really quick. There's this myth out there that secular people use reason and religious people or people who believe in Jesus use this empty, foolhardy thing that we call faith. And that's really a myth because it actually takes faith and reason to either believe in Jesus or to not believe in him. To believe in the existence of God takes faith, and it's also a reasonable claim. And to not believe in God, to not believe in the existence of God, is also a reasonable claim, but also takes tremendous amount of faith. And I would actually argue that it takes more faith not to believe in God and not to believe that Jesus is God than it does to believe the contrary. I think that there is more evidence to the fact that God exists and Jesus is Him than there is otherwise. But we don't really have time to talk about that. I would love to talk about that with you at some point. But Nathanael, despite all his objections, goes and he goes and meets Jesus. And did you hear what Jesus says to him? He said, "Here is an Israelite in which there is no deceit." Jesus is not being mean here, but he's calling Nathanael on his arrogance. He's saying, this is someone who cannot be fooled. This is someone who knows what he's talking about. But did you see Nathanael's response? Nathanael's response was that he was moved, that he was surprised by Jesus. He says to Jesus, he says, "How do you know me?" Apparently, something that Jesus said to Nathanael let Nathanael into the fact that Jesus was seeing right through him, that Jesus knew him. And it makes Nathanael pause. It makes Nathanael stop, and he says, "How do you know me?" And Jesus says, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip even called you. I saw you under the fig tree before we even met." And listen, we don't know what the fig tree is. I mean, we know what a fig tree is, but we don't know what Jesus is talking about. We don't know what moment that Nathanael was under a fig tree. There is no record in the Bible of Nathanael being under a fig tree before he met Jesus. So we don't know exactly what Jesus is talking about here, but it's a moment that Nathanael is aware of, and it's a moment that Jesus is aware of. And who knows what kind of a moment it is. Maybe it was one of the lowest points in Nathanael's life. Maybe it was a point in which Nathanael really needed God to show up, and it seems like he didn't, and that's why Nathanael doesn't believe. Whatever the case may be, Jesus says, "I saw you in that moment." Don't miss this. Jesus says to Nathanael the skeptic, "I saw you. I saw you." Jesus looks at the skeptic and he says, "I see you." And throughout the whole Bible, there's this theme of God seeing people in the times where they need Him most. God sees Hagar and her son Ishmael when they're out in the wilderness and they're starving to death. When Abraham is about to lose his son and he really is desperate for God to come up with a solution, God sees him. When the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, God sees their affliction. When people need Him most, God sees them. And so Nathanael is in this moment where he's just meeting this supposed Messiah, the supposed Savior, and he's got his doubts, he's got his skepticism, and Jesus looks him in the eye and says, "I saw you in that moment. I wasn't absent. I saw you." You see, Jesus is not threatened by our unbelief, by our doubt. Like, whether or not you believe in Jesus, Jesus is not threatened by that. He's not insecure. And so Jesus looks at the skeptic and says, "Whether you see me for who I am or not, I see you and I know you and I love you." And it's that fact in this story that actually causes Nathanael to believe. There's a second story about a guy named Thomas. Jesus meets Nathanael, or this story about Jesus meeting Nathanael is from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. This story about his interaction with Thomas is actually at the very end of his ministry. Thomas has been following Jesus for a long time, for 3 years now. And he knows Jesus. He's seen what Jesus has done. He sees what Jesus can do. And at this point, Jesus has died and rose again, just like he said he would. And some of the disciples have actually seen Jesus post-resurrection. They've seen the risen Jesus, but Thomas wasn't there when they got to see him. And so he doesn't believe yet. Check out what the story says. It says, "Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.'" Thomas has been with Jesus for a while. He's seen him do some incredible things. He's seen him raise the dead. He's seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, feed 5,000 people, turn water into wine, walk on water. He's seen all of it. And he's in this moment. Like here, Thomas has given up everything to follow Jesus. Like, Thomas believes in Jesus. No one on earth would call him a skeptic. But he is, in this moment, he's got his doubts. He's got his doubts. His friends come to him and say, "We've seen the risen Lord." And Thomas is like, "I need proof. I need hard evidence. I need to see the wounds in his hands. I need to see his side. I need to feel. I need to touch him. I'm not going to believe it until I've got the hard evidence." And you see how Jesus responds to him? Check it out. Check out how Jesus responds to him. It says, "A week later, his disciples," Jesus' disciples, "were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.'" Which, imagine, first of all, you're just sitting in a room, doors are locked and everything, and Jesus just appears and he's like, "Peace, guys." And you're like, whoa, like that's nuts in and of itself. But we don't got time to talk about that. It says, "Then Jesus said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe.'" So Jesus comes to where Thomas is, and he looks at him. We've got no record of Thomas and Jesus having this conversation about touching his hands and feeling his side. We've got no record of that conversation. It just seems that Jesus may have seen that, may have already known that. And he looks at Thomas, he knows exactly what he needs, and he meets him right where he is in his doubt. And he says, "Feel my hands. Touch my side." Now, it's important for you to know that Jesus doesn't always do this for everybody. If you're someone who needs to be able to feel his hands and touch his sides in order to believe that Jesus really is who he says he was, it's not likely that Jesus is going to do that for you. Jesus is asked all the time in the Gospels for him to show empirical proof about who he's claiming to be, and he doesn't actually give it most of the time. And I think that's because he knows that it's not likely to actually sway us. Even if we had empirical proof, we'd find some other way of explaining him away. But what Jesus does with Thomas and with everybody else in our doubt, notice he doesn't scold Thomas. He doesn't yell at him. He's not ashamed of him. He meets Thomas where he is, and he invites Thomas to explore the facts. He invites Thomas to consider the evidence. He invites Thomas to come to him, to touch him, to see him, and to figure out his doubts along the way. That's what he does. So, do you struggle with believing that God is faithful, for example? Consider the evidence. Has God not proven himself faithful over and over again? Do you struggle with the idea that Jesus could really do what he said he's going to do? Has he not proven that he is able over and over and over again? Do you struggle with the idea that Jesus could really love you? Is the cross not evidence enough that Jesus really does love you? Our doubts don't turn Jesus away. They don't make him insecure. They don't make him angry. Jesus meets us in our doubts, and he invites us to consider the evidence. And I think the vast majority of people who really explore Jesus, who really take his invitation to consider the evidence, to look at him, to come and see, as Philip invites Nathanael. Those who take that invitation, I think most of them end up believing, because Jesus proves himself every time. So here's what I want you to know. Maybe you've got doubts about whether or not Jesus exists. You're a skeptic. You have a hard time believing that Jesus really is who he says he is. I want you to know Jesus sees you, and he knows you, and he loves you. Whatever the reason is for you not believing, Jesus is not threatened by it, but he's always right here inviting you to come and see. Or maybe you have believed in Jesus, but you struggle with doubt. Sometimes you have a hard time believing that Jesus is really who he says he is in your own way. I want you to know Jesus is not angry with you. Jesus is not threatened by your doubt. He can handle it. What he does is he invites you to come and to consider the evidence. And I promise you, if you receive that invitation, you take that invitation, Jesus will prove himself every time. I love you guys, and I can't wait to see you next time.